Have been all my life, which is 86 years in a few days' time. I've seen flying right from its inception, just about. I wasn't here when the Ogilvy aeroplane was built, but I was always very interested in it and what had gone on. And I had the first photographs I saw of it was in Leo White's book, a photograph that's sitting up on the ramp that they built to assist the thing in getting into the air. But that was the only real picture I saw of it until we saw the picture that last time we were here that Arnold Wright had. And there's some excellent shots of being built and the engine and running the aircraft outside the hangar and whatnot. Anyhow, I knew that the people who had built it were in the motor business here, and the building uptown, which is now occupied by Raphael Studios, and had been the Ford company, it had been Newman's, it had been a garage originally called Hawkins and Rome. Now Hawkins was an ex-army officer, and he must have been keen on aviation. Mind you, this is 1908, and by that time a lot of flying had been done in England. They weren't starting off on anything like the Wright brothers, and they had dozens of books had been written about aeroplanes and building of them and whatnot. And a bloke called Ogilvy, who was also an enthusiast, he was employed to build this machine, and everything was done here in Napier. The whole was completely wooden, of course, fabric covered. And when it came to an engine, the engine was, well, a motorcycle engine, but it wasn't nearly enough power. And somebody here, I forget just who the people were, but they actually built the engine. They built another engine altogether, much bigger and more horsepower. And in 1912, I think it was, 1911 or 12, Lord Kitchener visited New Zealand with the idea of getting our forces into some kind of order, because the First World War was imminent, of course. Even by that time it was well known that would happen. And he was taken out by somebody here, by the military people here, and shown the aeroplane. And I don't know whether he knew one end of an aeroplane from another, but he'd probably seen them in England, all right, because they'd already started being common in England, and the Air Force already was founded, although it wasn't called the Royal Air Force at the time, it was part of the Army. So his suggestion was that he should go to England and take the thing over there. But of course the war came along very shortly afterwards, and but an aeroplane was built from their designs and actually flew in some of the early magazines, or some of the flight magazines and that, they were actually mentioned there. So I knew that met a lady who turned out to be the daughter of Mrs. Hawkins, and she was a Kettle. The Kettle family were very well known around there, Williams and Kettle, and she was one of the Kettle daughters. And she had shifted back to Napier. She had been living in America for some years, and so I got in touch with her and was able to go and see her. She was an elderly lady by that time, of course. This was about probably 40 years ago. But I had a very interesting talk to her about how they took the thing to England, and their idea was that they had invented the aileron control for lateral control, but I think they were up the pole there. I think that the ailerons had been used before that, and some of the had been experimented with various other people. So they although they said that they had invented it, I didn't believe it at the time when I read it. And what happened to the people after that, I don't know. Just what happened to the bits of it, or the hangar was over in Riverbend Road for a long time, where it was actually built. It was built round about where Maranui is now. That's where there was a decent sized field, and that's where the first flying was done. The first instruction was done there by using Hastings aeroplanes at Riverbend Road. It wasn't until the earthquake that we were able to shift out to the embankment aerodrome. Prior to that, what little flying had been done here was done from there. And the very first flight, or attempted flight here, was by an American who brought a Blériot to New Zealand in 1914. And he flew it in Auckland briefly, and then they brought it down here and flew it from Anderson Park, which was then the race course. And it was blowing, it was in June, middle of June 1914, just before the war started. And he didn't want to fly. He said no, it was too windy for the old Blériot, which liked to fly in practically still air. However, he was more or less forced into flying. He ended up like hanging it up in a gum tree. So he packed up the bits and took it back to Australia. And a strange thing about that whole thing was the chap who was with him at the time was a boy of about 15, and he was Bert Hinclair, who was later on a famous flyer. Flew in England and Australia and did some marvellous flying during the First World War, but he was only 15 when he was with Stone. He went back to Australia and went over to England and got a job with the Avro Company, just as a mechanic, and he eventually flew in the Royal Naval Air Service. And it was quite a story on its own.
So what happened to this airfield that they had over
At the Riverbend Road?
Yeah.
Well, I imagine it was just when the Richmond block was the first, where you lived,
yes,
where your
yes,
people
Richmond
lived.
block, yep,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, that was cut up into 5 acres or
blocks,
something like
yes,
that.
Yep. That was
And
after
that would
the 31
be-
earthquake.
It was just after the earthquake, and that was always dry land there. It wasn't swamp.
Yep.
It was dry. There was swamp further over, where Maranui Park is.
Yes. Yep.
I remember when that was still swampy.
Sure.
But they cut those up and people got, some of the houses are still there, you can see them being altered a bit, but I imagine that that hangar and everything else was pulled down then, and
Then it came over here to Pandora.
they shifted the hangar
Yeah. Over to Pandora.
to the embankment aerodrome.
Yes. Embankment area.
Yeah, just on the corner of the hill there.
Yes.
Yeah.
But now that was closed because they used to get downdrafts or something coming down the Onipota Gully, didn't they? And had an effect on the aircraft, and that's why they came more over here.
Well, probably
Yeah,
did. Yeah,
sure.
well, that was just over the top of the hill there. Could have been, if there'd been a strong easterly blowing. And
I thought one of the De Havilland aircraft from what it was, Union Airways, had a prang or something
Yeah.
around there.
yeah, Ron Kirkup, he piled it one up.
Yeah.
That's in his book, that book.
Yes, it's in the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in the book.
And it bent but it was only a fortnight and they had it back in the air again. But one of the worst prangs on the aerodromes I remember well was a chap called Curlett, Huey Curlett. He's one of the old garage people. He was Des Fennick, remember Des? Well, sorry. Well, it was his cousin. And when I was going to school in Wanganui, I met him there because we had a pageant in 1930 one in Wanganui, and we'd gone out to it, of course, and actually see the Bristol fighters and grebes and things that they had. And we met Huey Curlett, and he was flying a very, very nice moth from Marston. That's where he lived. And on Christmas Eve, I think it was 1933, he had come up to Hastings from Marston to deliver somebody off over at the Beacons Aerodrome. And the people gone out to meet them, and he never got it. He didn't leave the aircraft. He just, whether he fueled up or not, I'm not sure, but he just hopped in and was blowing a strong westerly wind. Just the thin kind of thing that happens so easily when you're exuberant. And he took off into the westerly and then turned straight out of the wind. He ended up right in front of the crowd of people that had been farewelling him with the moths in 1,000 pieces. Yeah.
Murphy's Law, I think.
Murphy's Law. Yeah.
Murphy's Law.
Yeah.
It can go wrong, it will go wrong.
It will, yeah.
Turn too early.
Yeah, it turns out
That's right.
the aircraft didn't have any forward speed. That was the trouble. And he didn't have enough height to regain his speed. But anyhow, I don't remember much about the flying here in the 20s, because I lived at Pronga Howe at that time, and my people had the pub down there. And but my first flight was in an Avro, in a Spartan, Simmons Spartan, in 1930, and it was at that time I had an idea that it was at Hastings. Although in some of the photos here that appears at over here at the ZK.
Was it ABZ?
ABZ. It still exists anyhow, that aeroplane. It's one of the ones that's still down in the.
Yeah.
It's either in the
museum.
museum at Geraldine.
That's right.
Yeah, ABM, I think it was. It's just off the top of my head. But anyhow, I've got a photograph of it. But that was my first introduction to aeroplanes. I'd always been intrigued by aeroplanes, and a book that we had when I was about 10, I suppose. It was called the Chums Annual. It was a book that came out, a weekly paper, like the Boys' Own paper, and they bound them up into an annual. And there was a exploded drawing of a Avro 504K. And I looked at that thing, it was just wore the paper out. Of course, Avro 504Ks were very common around New Zealand at that time. The whole lot were flying not from here, but from Hastings, and taking up. I never had the opportunity of going for a flight in it, unfortunately. But
So were they a radial engine or
rotary.
Rotary. Right. Okay.
It'll be
Yes,
one
yes.
about being rebuilt now in Marco, and they've got all the bits and run the engine. And so maybe I might get a flight in it before I depart.
Well, you know.
Right. Well,
So then the war years came. So you
well,
ended up
my war years, I tried to get in as a pilot before the war. I wanted to fly, and I put in the necessary papers, and I was called up before an old Air Commodore. He was a real crotchety old red-faced so-and-so sitting behind his desk, and he said, how much time can you put in flying? Because we're going to be paid for it. The government were going to pay for it. And I said, I had a boss who had been an RFC mechanic, and I'd have had no trouble getting time off. And anyhow, what's his name now? He looked up at me and he said, "Mechanic, eh?" I said, "Yep, we're going to need you blokes." Exactly what he said. In other words, I knew very well that when the war started, there wouldn't be time to train mechanics.
And the flying career didn't look quite so obvious.
No. Well, anyone, the whole thing was that you could be a ploughman or a road mender or
Oh yeah,
a drover or whatever and learn to fly. And,
yeah.
whereas we'd already had the skills. I was already an A-grade mechanic and passed my A-grade certificate. And anyhow, I stayed on the Air Force Reserve, and when the war came, I was within a month I was well, it was a short, sharp 16-week course on flight mechanics course, they call that, but you didn't, it was more servicing than overhaul work. But later on I did a complete course on engine overhaul, and that's what I did during the war. I could go on for ages talking about my flying experiences during the war, because whenever I got the opportunity, there was a thing that I knew that just flying, I'd be in there in all kinds of things. But it's time somebody else had a go at it. But Cyril can tell you a lot of interesting things about his career.
Well, actually, I have done a tape on this before, so I won't reiterate that. But you were talking about crashes on this airfield, and much to my horror and disgust, I did have an accident on this airfield. And that happened to be when, after I'd been in the services, I'd been training on Harvards and Devons, and the only tail draggers, of course, were the Harvards, and the Devon was a trike undercarriage, and I came back to take over from Pete Van Ash, who had flown the Beechcraft for many thousands of hours, and seeing nobody else in New Zealand had a Beechcraft rating, Pete was designated to be my instructor, and he was not an instructor. He didn't have an instructor's rating.
Okay, no more.
And we came to Napier to do my type rating on the Beechcraft. Jack Roddy, that we spoke about before, was in the tower with a fellow by the name of Brain. And I can't think of his Christian name, Ray Brain. And they were the only two in the tower. And we were doing some circuits and bumps at Napier, and the wind happened to switch round to a strong westerly. And while I was in the circuit, and as we approached, I said to Pete, I don't like the crosswind. And he said, oh, you'll be all right, you're service trained, you'll be fine, just take it in and land it. Well, the Beechcraft was a pig of an aeroplane to land at the best of times. It had a built-in ground loop. Its crosswind component was 13 knots. I looked at the sock and I thought, the crosswind component is a lot more than 13. But, he said, no, you'll be right, carry on. So I carried on mistakenly, and as we landed, we couldn't hold it, and it went up on one wingtip and a fin and rudder, and we ground looped for about 300 metres, bending the bottom end of the fin and the wingtip. However, that's not the only part of the story. Jack Roddy saw this happening from the tower. He leapt out of the cab, down into the old, was it
GMC, GMC, yes.
and took off across the paddock towards us. He was the only person on board, and he was going flat out across the paddock, and when he arrived there, the GMC was on fire because he had forgotten to release the handbrake. However, we were quite all right. The aeroplane was only a slight amount of damage, and actually it was flown back to Hastings for repair. But it was rather an interesting exercise to see the fire engine arriving in a cloud of smoke.
had fire engine and fire. Little worry.
But getting away from aircraft, but we had it happen there, you know, vintage car rally. Only just recently, the guy should have known, his wife and he both should have known what was happening. But they drove about 10 miles with the handbrake on an old, it was a Chrysler, but it had the carbon shaft
Yes.
handbrake, and next
Yes.
thing it was pouring up through the floorboards, just about set fire to the floorboards.
Think of the efficiency of the motor.
That's geez.
Yeah, it'd
Yes,
be full throttle all the way.
yes, yep.
So,
You got to tell us about some of the funny things that you saw while you're here.
Well, I've been asked to take a few notes, and surprising how some things in this category stand out. My name's Matt Brown, and with an E, of course. And I started in air traffic control in 1948, and via various things ended up in Napier in 1977. Finished my time in the 89, wasn't it? Yes, 41 years, of which I had 12 here at Napier. Now, I was called, when I came here, an aerodrome superintendent, with pieces of paper which said I was representative of the Civil Aviation Division Director, etc., under section so-and-so. I could do almost anything sort of stuff. Then I became a senior controller. Then the Airways Corporation came in, and I became the chief controller. You know, I suppose we call a lot of other names, but that seemed to sort of cover most of the official titles. But a particular things that come to mind, in 9 months after my arrival here, after 12 years at AHAC here, luckily, this incident was an A4 Skyhawk, which had been landing, came through here and went overhead. We got clearance for it and disappeared off to AHAC here. And then 5 minutes after we transferred it, and that's the end of that one. AHAC rings back and said, retransferred it back to us and said he's returning to Napier, our weather's packing up and he's on low fuel. Our low fuel was pretty serious because as the higher he went, he had just done a NEF refuel up near East Cape and been a jam, a lump or something. I won't say what it was, but it was found, something. And of course, higher up the pressure zone, more fuel kept coming out. So he had to get back and get down in a hell of a hurry. So he came back. And he landed with practically no fuel remaining. And did the usual proper thing, because he had his number 2 alongside him, just to make sure everything was okay. And at the debrief, there were some very harsh comments made by about the number of engines on the tarmac for the number of aircraft. In fact, there were 7 aircraft on the tarmac, strangely enough. One was a Bristol, which was a good firefighter, or lighter if you wanted one at the time. And this fire chief complained bitterly that there were more fire engines than aeroplanes on the tarmac, and that he had actually had to pull in fire engines from Hastings to cover Napier. And this is at the debrief here. He wasn't very happy about that, but that was one of the difficulties we had. But the aircraft taxied in and parked on the tarmac, and we eventually got it out of the flat a couple of days later. But that came to mind fairly quickly. And then another one that occurred to me was a bomb on board on the Napier Christchurch Friendship. Somebody rang up Engine and told them that there was a barometric pressure bomb on board which would explode when the aircraft went through 10,000 feet. So of course the captain didn't bother about it. He turned it around straight away. The airport emergency procedures went on. Everybody did all what they're supposed to do. And then after landing, and the safe area at that stage is right out there, as you can see behind you, gentlemen, away from the Aero Club, and this is where hopefully if the bomb went off it wouldn't cause too much damage. And they got the cordon established, and the police had supervised this and checked of the aircraft. Of course, I always feel sorry for the loaders in these situations, because they're the only ones who know where things are, and somehow or another they're supposed to go in there and find this damn bomb thing. So this is all right, this was all done, and finally they loaded. They accepted the fact it was clear. The captain's only complaint was that he couldn't get his cap, because the cordon had been established and nobody could care less who he was. He was not going back inside until they had checked the airplane. But he was quite happy with this situation. He thought, that's fine, but he thought he'd make a small Irish type of compliment, I suppose, I don't know. And then they got him all back and all fixed up, and they loaded the aeroplane, and what do you know? There are 4 passengers missing. So what, gentlemen, with all your brains and thoughts and experience, where would these 4 passengers be?
It's a West Shore pub.
They're on to it, absolutely.
Sure
A chap thought about it down there, grabbed a taxi, drove down to the West Shore pub, found them there steadying the old nerves, and they came, picked them up, put them back in the taxi, put them on board, and off the aeroplane went. And behind the story was somebody in Napier didn't want somebody to go to Christchurch, and this is how they achieved their object. Whether they ever did, I understand the police actually caught this character.
Yeah.
So that was a sort of exciting day for everybody. One of the sad ones was a crash on the airfield in the low flying area, which is southwest sector of the field, and 2 young people were killed. One young budding pilot took up his young lady, which he shouldn't have done, into a low flying area or anything else. And of course it's down below a whole pile of pines if you happen to look out there, and said he'd crashed for some minutes before we could see anything. And there was somebody in the circuit, luckily, who told us about this. And he told us that it was 3 kilometres southwest of the airfield. So we responded to this, set the fire engines away from here, racing down the road. It was 5 o'clock at night. Always has to be about then. Murphy's Law. And then he saw this fire engine racing off there. He said, oh, they're going the wrong way. Well, he said, where is the crash? But by this time we had no idea too, because there was smoke coming up behind the pine trees. He said, it's on the airfield side of the estuary. Thank you. So we called the fire engine and turned them all around. They came out a screaming U-turn at Taradale Road, just past the fire station, which by this stage was pouring out all their people they had on board, and they'd seen the fire engine from the airport going there, so they came out and they went down that road too. Only to find that the fire engine got his new instructions, turn around, the whole damn lot turned around through the 5 o'clock traffic and raced back to the airfield, went up Watchman Round, down the end of the runway to where the crash site was. I mean, it was all over bar the shouting, and one of the difficulties of that was that somebody was on the phone